All right, so this particular part of the course is a little bit different. We're going to get into the integumentary system and the bones for this particular week. And a lot of this is going to be some review, so I'm going to go through some of the stuff relatively quickly, but we will at least put a focus on some of the physiology that maybe you just touched on in anatomy, and we'll get a little bit deeper into it. But for this first video on the skin, we're going to talk about the major physiological roles with the integumentary system. We're going to talk about the layers of the skin and what they do. We're going to talk about the different types of cells we find, both in the epidermis as well as the dermis, and then talk about how we make a water barrier with the skin. So just as a reminder, right, a lot of this video for today is just going to be a lot of overview. The main things with the integumentary system is the skin and all of the accessory structures that come with it. So hair, nails, glands, right, that are embedded in with the skin. And the overall function, the overall goal of the integumentary system is to provide physical and chemical protection. It's going to help us regulate things like body temperature. It will help us eliminate some waste. It's also going to be involved in the synthesis of vitamin D. And then sensory information, such as touch, pain, temperature, so on and so forth. So what are the main things, the physiological roles that the skin plays? One is a mechanical barrier. It's a physical barrier against like physical damage, so cuts, abrasions, things like that, right? Your skin is going to be able to handle kind of a little bit of a rougher handling, or a rougher, I guess you could say like a rougher handling than the tissue underneath, right? It's a little bit tougher. It's also going to protect us against pathogens getting in. It will provide us with basically as a shield against UV light. UV light will cause genetic mutations, right? It will cause mutations in DNA. And so having the skin that can kind of absorb some of that UV light, right? We have melanin, which provides us some protection against that UV light, will help us avoid that extra damage, right? Of course, there's only so much that the skin can take before it too is damaged, leading to something like skin cancer. It's going to help us with temperature homeostasis. So the blood vessels that are found in the skin, we can regulate, where blood, how close to the surface blood is being pumped in the skin, so that we can, if it's really cold, we can keep blood deeper in to maintain warmth, or if it's very hot, we can allow blood to flow through the veins and arteries and whatnot that are closer to the surface to dissipate heat. We also have things like sweat glands to help with that thermoregulation. And then sensory information, right? We can take in information about our external environment, right? Knowing kind of what's going on around us so that we can make adjustments to the body, adjustments to our placement, right? Or whatever, right? Based on that sensory information. And then when it comes to metabolism, right, we have vitamin D synthesis, right, which we need in order to absorb calcium and to help form bone. It's also going to help get rid of excessive electrolytes, so things like potassium can be released in sweat. And then we can store energy long term in the form of fats in the subcutaneous layer. Now there are three main layers, or three main regions when we're looking at the skin, two of which are true skin, epidermis and dermis. And then the hypodermis down below that is going to be fatty tissue, right? It's going to be adipose. And we can use the skin to basically give medications, right? This is something we'd have to puncture the skin for this, but there's various ways we can do that. So things like antibiotics, vaccines, or testosterone injections can be given in the form of what's called an intramuscular, where we go all the way through the skin, all the way down to the muscle. We can do subcutaneous, like insulin, epinephrine. That's going to be just into the fatty area, right? So underneath the skin in that adipose tissue. And then intradermal, so allergy testing, TB testing, get that little bubble, right? That's going into the actual skin itself. So there's a few different things that we do. There's a few different ways that we kind of use the anatomy of the skin, right, when it comes to providing medical care. So let's get into the details of these 3 layers. And again, I'm going to be very fast with this because at least in my class in anatomy, we've already covered this. So this should feel like review. If not, take some time to review this. So there's 3 layers. There's the epidermis, which is what you see, right? That's going to be what you see on the outside. This is made of keratinized stratified squamous epithelial cells. So we just have these keratin-filled, mostly dead, flat epithelial cells that are just stacked and stacked and stacked on top of each other, as well as some other cells like Langerhans cells, melanocytes, Merkel cells, nerve endings, right, so on and so forth. And there's no blood vessels here, and this is why, you know, if you get a small cut, right, you may see like there's a little flap of skin, but there's absolutely no blood, and that's because in this layer we have no blood vessels, and so no blood vessel means no blood. This is going to help provide protection, so it's going to help protect us physically, it's going to help prevent water loss, it's going to provide thermosensation and pain sensations, things like touch, so it's like those Merkel cells and whatnot, those will help us with like light vibrations and whatnot. The dermis, this is where, like, I call it the meat and potatoes layer. The dermis is going to be where like all the really fun stuff is at. So blood vessels, nerve endings, hair follicles, oil glands, immune cells, fibroblasts, I mean, all sorts of crazy stuff is going to be there. We get sensation for tactile stuff. We get thermoregulation happening here with the blood vessels, as well as with things like sweat glands. There's a lot going on in the dermis, so it's generally what we'll put our focus on. The hypodermis, right, sometimes called the subcutaneous layer, this is going to be mainly adipose, fatty tissues. There are some blood vessels, there are some nerves, but we're mainly talking about fats. And so this is going to provide insulation, it can provide padding, think like a little bit of padding to help protect the organs that are underneath, and then also serve as a long-term energy storage that we can break down if for whatever reason we don't have access to food. So let's start with the epidermis, where we have 4 to 5 layers depending if it's thin or thick skin. So everything that you see in black on this slide you find that in all skin, but this one middle one, the stratum lucidum, that one is only going to be in thick skin, which is what you think of when you think of your palms, your fingertips, your soles, kind of where skin is definitely a lot thicker, right? A lot thicker in comparison, right? So the palms, the soles of your feet, your fingertips, right? All those things, those are going to have all 5, right? But if we're looking at like the skin that's on your forearm, the skin that's on your belly, right? That skin is only going to have the corneum, the granulosum, the spinosum, and basal. If you're trying to remember the layers of the epidermis in order, I have a little trick to it. Just a little mnemonic device or memory device for you. This is going from top to bottom. It does include the lucidum, so you'll have to keep that in mind, but the way I remember it is Cancer loves getting sunburns. And so that can help you remember the order of these, right, based on their name. So if we look at what we see, right, the stratum corneum is all just dead, right? It's dead cells that are constantly shedding off, right? This is going to provide us a protective feature, right, even though they're dead. It's a physical barrier. We can afford to lose those layers of cells. So mild abrasions, things like that are not going to be very problematic. Underneath we have the stratum lucidum. Then we have the stratum granulosum. Named such, it actually does appear grainy. So we have these keratohyalin granules. Basically, there's a bunch of keratin in these granules in there, right? And lipid-filled granules. And so when you look at it under a microscope, it really does look like it is grainy. And these are in the process of dying. So you see, like, as we're going deeper, right, or I should say as we go from deep up, right, we're seeing that the cells are going through the process of dying. And the closer they are to the surface, the closer they are to death. Next, we have the stratum spinosum, where they are basically these spiny, see all these little kind of lines coming off. They look like little spines. It's not as obvious under a microscope, but bear with me, right? We see them there. And then down at the bottom in this single layer, this is the stratum basal. And anytime you see basal or basal, you want to think baseline, right? So this is the base of the epidermis. This is where these cells are basically coming from. So as we move up the layers, these cells are developing from that stratum basal. So let's take a look at the different types of cells we can find in the epidermis. Most of them are going to be keratinocytes. These are the squamous cells. They make keratin, they eventually fill with keratin, flatten out, and die. And so this is like where we're getting that protective feature, like physically. Because that keratin is insoluble, right, it's going to protect us against water loss. So the watertight kind of component to skin is coming from the keratin. That's going to be about 90% of the cells we find in the epidermis. But we'll also have some melanocytes. So these are these little cells, you see them right here in this kind of gray color. These are going to be basically producing melanin. So they produce this melanin, they package it up in these little what we call melanosomes, and then those are sent upward into the other layers. And this melanin is a protective pigment, right? So it's a pigment that can absorb light, and namely it can absorb UV light, right? It does scavenge for free radicals, but I'm not worried about that so much. I'm more worried about you understanding melanin's role in protecting us by absorbing UV light, right? And since we're absorbing UV light, it's not going to, that UV light can't impact the cells around it, and so it gives us a protective feature from skin cancer. Another small amount of the cells are going to be Langerhans cells. This is immune. These are cells that are involved with the immune system. They are phagocytes, meaning they can engulf pathogens and whatnot that somehow get past the top layers. And then Merkel cells, which are going to be kind of all spread out. They're going to sense touch, right? Now, any of these can become cancerous, right? Any of these can become cancerous. Any cell really could become cancerous, but generally speaking, when we talk about cancer, we're talking about the keratinocytes and the melanocytes for the most part. So when we hear things like squamous cell carcinoma, basal cell carcinoma, melanoma, generally we're talking about one of those two, which when you think about it, that's 95% of the cells in the skin, so it makes sense that most skin cancers will deal with one of those two. All right, so let's talk about the water barrier. Again, we need to prevent water loss so that and prevent water intake. We don't want water to just soak in. We don't want to be like a sponge. And so we have this protein envelope and a lipid envelope, right? Basically coming from those keratohyalin granules and the lamellar bodies, the lamellar granules as well that are coming from that stratum granulosum. So the keratinization, where we form that protein envelope in the cell, we basically just keep cross-linking it as the cell dies out. And then the lipids, the ceramides, the cholesterol, the fatty acids, right, this is going to contribute to what we call the acid mantle. The skin has a slightly acidic pH, right? And we build a lipid envelope, right? Again, remember, if it's lipid, water is not going to want to penetrate through a lipid-based substance, right? Because lipids are hydrophobic, right? So this can help prevent water from seeping through from inside the body to the outside, as well as prevent water from just soaking in like a sponge. Now looking at the dermis, this is where we have blood vessels, nerves, nerve endings, glands, muscles, hairs, all sorts of fun stuff. And we have two different regions. We have the papillary region and the reticular region. The papillary region is just below that epidermis, and it has kind of, see that kind of wavy approach? If we look at how the epidermis is not just a straight line, it kind of bounces up and down, and that papillary region is the dermis right below that wavy line. And so each of those little extensions of the dermis up towards the epidermis is called a papilla. Or a papilla, depending on who you talk to. But this is going to be made of loose, irregular areolar tissue, so it's areolar connective tissue there. We see some collagen, elastin fibers, some fibroblasts, some ground substance, things like capillaries that can be used to dissipate body heat to cool us down. These little ridges is also where our fingerprints come from, right? So the unique patterning to your dermal papillae is going to give you your fingerprints. Now, deeper than that, we get the reticular region. This is where we see dense, irregular connective tissue. We have lots of collagen, lots of elastin, a lot of fibroblasts, and a lot of components like nerve endings and hair follicles, glands, right? All sorts of stuff. Down below that, the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, this is not actually skin. This is going to be fatty tissue. So this is what we can also call the cutaneous fascia. This is where we see adipocytes, so we're seeing adipose tissue. We can also root the erector pili muscles down here. But the whole role here is to protect and insulate and store as an energy reserve. So if we look at everything together, you can just take a second to look at this picture here. I'm not going to spend too much time here, so you can pause here if you really want to, but we see how everything's kind of arranged together, right? So at the very top is the epidermis. In the middle there, we have the dermis. And then down at the very bottom, we see the hypodermis.